Welcome back to another episode of the weekly injury report here at MDS Mobility Doc Sports, where it's in your care. This is championship week for most fantasy football leagues. Like I said, if you haven't heard before, I'm cruel and I push it out another week, so it's still the quarterfinals for us, I believe. But I'll have to look. Regardless, it's time to get down and dirty. This is the real time where you need everybody to perform. And unfortunately, there were a couple of injuries, nothing too major by the sounds of it, but there's some pretty big fantasy names that are up in the air that we're going to have to pay attention to and we'll talk about today. Unfortunately, like half of them are on my team. But regardless, let's get into it. First one, who is on my team, the running back for Arizona, James Conner, who's been having a really good year. He's a great dual threat running back. Does a little bit of everything for them. He left last week's game in the fourth quarter with a knee injury. He was a limited participant on Wednesday. If he is able to go, and I expect he will be able to, then I wouldn't expect a huge drop-off in his play. He's a great back, physical. He can catch out of the backfield. If he does play, maybe there's a little bit of a concession of snaps towards Trey Benson or another backup running back. But if he is able to go, I expect him to still put up the points that we're used to seeing so far this year. Davante Adams, current bright spot at least for the Jets. Used to be Breece Hall, now it's Davante Adams. He is on the injury report with a hip injury. He was a non-participant at practice as well, but I imagine that he'll play. It doesn't seem to be anything too serious, but you never know. So something to keep an eye on, especially since he played in 97% of the snaps for the offense in the past couple of games, if not at least last week. And with Rodgers there, you know he's always going to look his way. So if he plays, he's definitely going to produce, so make sure you keep an eye on his status moving forward. Another wide receiver, CeeDee Lamb, still on the injury report with that AC injury. If you happen to watch last week's game against Tampa, he missed a couple of drives where they had a little bit of a lead. They were letting some other wide receivers and younger players play a little bit, and then he ended up coming back in. You could tell, though, he was not confident about being tackled, and he was trying to protect himself when he landed. And specifically, I think there was one play, actually, where he was taken down right on that shoulder and that AC joint that flared it up a little bit for him. So he's been playing through it for the past couple of weeks. I don't expect that to change, but make sure you keep an eye on him, especially with this being the fantasy championship week. Another huge player that's on the injury report is Alvin Kamara. He missed last week's game. We talked about him on the podcast last week, excuse me. But he did not play with that groin injury, and obviously the Saints were handled pretty cleanly by the Steelers, I believe, or whoever it was that they were playing. But regardless, he's questionable currently. He was a non-participant Wednesday at practice, so we're hoping that he does play. We kind of want to see him do some positional, individual, or even team drills on Thursday or Friday leading up to Sunday when they play, and hopefully he'll be able to go because he is a true offensive weapon for that Saints team that is in desperate need of some offensive help. Drake London, the wide receiver for Atlanta, he actually left the game last week with a hamstring injury, but supposedly he was able to come back in if they felt it was necessary. Obviously they didn't. They won regardless, but something to pay attention to because they're playing in Washington this week where it might be a little bit colder. A lot of times those soft tissue muscular injuries, especially with something like a hamstring where it is so explosive, so powerful, and such a quick reaction time that's needed for that contraction, then sometimes those can be a little bit easier to flare up and tighten up on him in that colder weather. So something to pay attention to, and if he is able to play, which I'm expecting he will, if you have another option on the bench, it might be a safer bet just in case something does happen in the game and he ends up missing an extensive period of time. Jalen Hurts. Philly fans had a rough go last week where the offense was moving and then Hurts took a extra hit on a tackle going towards the ground, and he left with a concussion, and he's also on the injury report with a left finger injury, which was on there from a week or two prior. He was a non-participant on Wednesday, and they're not sure where he's trending. It's currently up in the air for him. If he isn't able to go, Kenny Pickett will play. Again, he played fairly well. There were a couple of big plays where Devontae Smith dropped the ball, Saquon Barkley dropped the ball. That could have put the game away. And obviously Pickett isn't necessarily Jalen Hurts, especially not from a fantasy perspective. But for Philly fans as a whole, I think Pickett can do it. You have enough talent around there to help him. but something to keep an eye on. Staying in the NFC East, Tyrone Tracy and Malik Neighbors are both on the injury report with an ankle and hip injury respectively. They both were non-participants in practice, but they've been playing through injuries for the past couple weeks, same injuries, and I expect them to play regardless. Both Tracy and Neighbors will see volume and should be able to produce off of that. Now, for our deep dive this week, we're going to be looking at a torn pectoralis major. Specifically, the two players, at least this year, that have had this injury are Jonathan Allen, the defensive end for Washington, and Rashawn Slater, the offensive tackle for the Chargers. Both of them being phenomenal players. I think they're both Pro Bowlers. I know Slater is. But regardless, your pec major, which is this big muscle that we think of with the pecs, you actually have a pec major, then a pec minor. But we're focusing on the major here. That pec major helps to flex, adduct, and internally rotate your shoulder. And the way that it attaches on your ribs, your sternum, and your clavicle, and then runs over and attaches onto your humerus. And the way that it attaches onto the humerus is kind of interesting. It'll actually twist a little bit as it becomes more tendinous. And so what ends up happening is the lowest muscle fibers end up attaching at the highest point on the humerus itself. So what that kind of does is it can predispose that lower portion of your pec to be a little bit more prone to rupture because those fibers are already on so much stretch. And that's also the most common way to injure your pec, whether it's an incomplete tear or a full tear, by having an eccentric contraction, which is where you're under load and you're stretching that muscle while at the same time contracting it. And eventually the load becomes too much for that muscle and tendon, and that's when you get the snap or that pop that people will commonly hear or say that they felt or heard whenever they tear a muscle. The population that's most common for this type of injury are 20 to 40-year-olds, especially athletes. Obviously football is very common, but also weightlifting is where you see this most commonly. Typically, non-operative treatment is the first option and usually the best option, especially if you're considered elderly or if it's an incomplete tear. If it is a complete tear, though, that's when they will do surgery, especially if you're an athlete, as it progresses a little bit faster. The goal for rehab, though, is you're going to initially protect that structure and tissue, right, to allow it to heal. And then you're going to start to work in that functional range of motion in all planes, ultimately leading to working on dynamic stability and strength and muscle control to support that joint and still have that muscle do its job. And finally, getting back to sport-specific activities. It's not a coincidence that both of these players that I mentioned, Allen and Slater, both play in the line. Slater, an offensive tackle. Allen, defensive end, I believe, not a tackle. Pretty sure he's an end. Regardless, though, they both play on the line. There's pulling, there's ripping. I mean, it's literally a move, right, where you rip past someone. So your arm and shoulders, as well, the rest of your body are going to be moved in different positions and different load that's going to be changing constantly. So you see these injuries a little bit more commonly in these line players because they're fighting with their hands so often. But that's a little bit of information on a torn pec. This week, like I said, is championships for a lot of fantasy football leagues. So if you are competing in your championship, good luck. If you're competing in the third place game or below, good luck as well. You know, hopefully you're not in last and there isn't a punishment. But if you celebrate it, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah, Merry Kwanzaa, the whole shebang. Hope everyone enjoyed their holiday season and we can all top it off with a fantasy win this week. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think in the bottom if there's anything else that you're curious about or want to hear in the upcoming episodes or something I can respond to in a comment. But until then, I'll see you in the next one.